thank you once again, and please stay back with us, as I mentioned. So we'll now move to our next speaker, Mr. Prasad Panda. Mr. Panda he is the Minister of Infrastructure, Government of Alberta. He was first elected to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta in a by-election in September 2015 as MLA for Calgary Foothills, and then re-elected in April 2019 as an MLA for the newly formed riding of Calgary Edgemont. Born in Sangam Jagarla Mudi, Andhra Pradesh, India, Mr. Panda has lived in the constituency of Calgary Edgemont for 15 years. A professional engineer by trade, he holds a Bachelor of Technology in Mechanical Engineering and worked in the energy sector for 28 years, including in senior management positions with Reliance Industries Limited, as well as Suncor Energy. Mr. Panda was a key member of the project management teams that has built projects worth over $100 billion, including petroleum, petrochemicals, power, pipelines, and marine infrastructure, and oil sands development projects. During the last legislature, Mr. Panda was a member of the Legislative Standing Committee on Public Accounts, Resource Stewardship, and Alberta's Economic Future. And he served as the official opposition critic for energy and economic development and trade. And he is currently Alberta's infrastructure minister, as I mentioned earlier. So over to you, Mr. Panda.
Namaste. Can you hear me, Vipulji?
Yes, absolutely, sir. Go ahead.
Excellent. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to all of those who joined from different time zones. Here in Alberta, the sun didn't raise that, and we are at minus 30 degrees. But, you know, my heart warms out when Vipulji asked me to come and join on a seminar with Indian officials. So great to see His Excellency Anshumanji, and I want to give a shout out to him and his colleagues, Ajay Baisaria ji, and in our area, Manish ji. They're all doing a great job. In Anshumanji and his wife and everyone is doing a great job in advancing the economic and cultural ties between two great democracies, Canada and India. And also people like Vipulji and Tejas and everyone working hard to deepen and strengthen those ties. As a Indo-Canadian, I'm always interested and look forward to participate in these kind of discussions. As a Minister of Infrastructure, on behalf of the Government of Alberta, it's my honor to be with you today. So I may be doing injustice to my officials and staff because I skip their notes every time I go talk about India, because I don't need any notes. So I know what's happening there. So I lived there long enough, and I still have family back home. So I'm still in touch with many of my former colleagues and everyone. So, but I'm quite impressed what Rahul presented just now. So I definitely want to have a copy of that presentation. And the next thing I'm going to do is ask our Invest Alberta. We also have an investment corporation to attract. It's a kind of single window process. We set up that Invest Alberta to facilitate and accelerate those deals. So I look forward to sign an MOU between Invest Alberta and Invest India soon, if possible. I also see others like Leah, one of the good infrastructure consulting company working in India. I'm in touch with Dr. Raju, your new president there. So they're doing important projects which are important not only to the nation but to the government, like the projects in Varanasi and other projects. So I'm pleased to see that. And as Government of Alberta, what we are doing to make life better for Albertans and Canadians is invest in modern infrastructure. For that, to actually legislate the criteria of project selection and prioritization, just 10 days ago, I introduced and passed the Alberta Investment Accountability Act, which will give predictability and also certainty for Albertans and Canadians, what type of infrastructure we're going to invest, considering not only the current needs, but also the future needs. For example, COVID taught us recently, how important is infrastructure to carry on with our daily lives in a pandemic scenario. So that's why we introduced that Infrastructure Act. But, people often expect politicians as a magic to build every fancy infrastructure they think of. We have our own limitations of funding because somebody has to pay for it. So that's why our government actually is trying to pursue public-private partnership to encourage private investments. So which we are on track now because we reduce corporate taxes. In Alberta has the lowest tax, 8%, and we don't have any provincial sales tax. So with all that, Alberta is probably the lowest, one of the lowest in North America out of the 50 states in US and 10 provinces in Canada. Probably we stand the lowest. And also we are on, we cut a lot of red tape to encourage private sector investment. And we are also using Canada Infrastructure Bank to finance vital infrastructure projects like broadband to rural communities or irrigation projects, because Alberta's strength is, natural resources. So we produce a lot of oil and gas. As a cold country, you would appreciate today, where I'm sitting in Calgary, it's -30. So without those comforts of the fossil fuels, reliable supply will be freezing. So, but we are also looking at diversifying our economy. We are looking at clean tech. Other presenters talked about the importance of renewable and clean energy. So Alberta is the leader in technology development and supplying. For example, I have introduced one of the Alberta companies, Ever. Ever is a geothermal company. We connected them with Reliance in India, who are interested to explore that. Same way, there are many opportunities, but I'm glad to see India has opened it up. Recently, we realized during the previous waves of COVID, there were issues with oxygen supply, for example, in India, because although they have, but they couldn't move it because the roads were not suitable to move 40 feet sea container type trailers across the road. So that's why I'm very pleased to see Government of India is going to invest on roads and airports and seaports. So that's what in Alberta. So to compare between Alberta and India, Alberta, we're not dense population and we are spaced out. That's why we had to maintain these thousands of kilometers of roads and bridges. And we are also focusing on other projects like broadband and aviation, irrigation. So that's where our investments are going. But what is expected from our government is to bring in accountability, consistency in policy, and cut taxes and cut red tape, which we are on track. And that's why recently we could, I'm happy to mention that we could attract companies from India, tech companies, because although we are building on our strengths in energy and, but we are also diversifying our economy. We're doing a lot of value add in our agriculture and forestry, which is a bright spot in our economy. I heard that India is recovering its economy post-pandemic, and you'll have 10% GDP. And Alberta will be the fastest in Canada with 7% GDP growth. So we worked really hard on Alberta recovery plan. We never stopped construction. In my department, we are on track to complete all the projects in construction, like 28 healthcare facilities, top-notch, world-class healthcare facilities, and we are building about 70 schools across the province, a lot of justice infrastructure. So when you talk about infrastructure, it touches every sector. So it's essential to deliver programs like much needed, the delivery of public programs. So it could be economic infrastructure like trade corridors, roads and bridges, airports, and all that, or social infrastructure like I mentioned, hospitals, schools, or the pipelines, which are essential in a big country like Canada. So we are focusing on all that, but there is a lot of potential between India and Alberta, and India and Canada. I know you mentioned companies like Fairfax, our good friend Prem Vatsa's group. They invested in aviation infrastructure there. Brookfield bought pipelines from my previous employer, Reliance. I mentioned air cargo, somebody mentioned. So Alberta airports like Calgary and Edmonton, they're on the important route to US. So all the cargo that right now you are transitioning in Alaska, Alberta airports will provide you very low cost options and for refueling. And also our runways are much wider and longer, suitable for any sort of aircrafts. So there are a lot of opportunities. And our premier, Jason Kenney, which Vipulji and others on the call are familiar, he's a good friend of India. He wants to develop, he was part of developing those relations in the past as a federal minister, and he can't wait till the COVID ends, and so we can go and sign up those memorandum of understandings and connect private sector investors, because there are a lot of opportunities. And recently I introduced him to my good friend, Tata Group Executive Chairman, Mr. Chandrasekharan. We invited him. He's waiting for the COVID to end. We're talking to other companies like biotech. I spoke to Dr. Krishna Allah, and I know that one of the Alberta companies has signed and exploring opportunity with the BioE. I spoke to Mahima Datla. She said they're negotiating that deal. There are a lot of opportunities in Alberta and Canada for Indian companies. But as our job as politicians is to provide that consistent, transparent, accountable policies, so investors have certainty. We heard about the difficulties in the past. When governments change, we should not be tempted to undo what the previous governments did, like tearing off contracts, like power purchase agreement contracts or anything. That won't give certainty and predictability to investors, particularly Canadian investors. They are very good partners, but they look for ease of doing business and predictability, and we had to create the trusting relationships. As soon as the COVID ends, we would invite all the Indian companies to come and look at our opportunities in Alberta and Canada, particularly in Alberta, because we are going to open it up for clean tech, and there are opportunities in hydrogen, for example. We want to build a lot of industrial plants producing hydrogen. We already had few projects announced, 3-4 projects. We're also looking at carbon capture and sequestering. That's other opportunity for Indian companies. I heard that India is looking at 1,000 gigawatts. So that's, you know, if your land base is not enough, Canada is a large country, second largest in the world, and so there are opportunities, because although it's cold here, -30 in Alberta, but the sun shines most of the time. So your companies can come and look at Alberta as a potential opportunity. So as I said, I can't wait to connect Invest Alberta and Invest India. And with the help of Anshumanji and his colleagues, we'll try to move forward that agenda. But glad to be here. We would like to take questions, but I'll stop there. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Minister Panda. And I must say, you are one of the most approachable, most down-to-earth political leaders I have come across in my 22 years in Canada. So thank you for always being there, always joining us. And for sure, I will share the presentation with you and connect you to Rahul as well. And hope to see that MOU materializing soon between Invest Alberta and Invest India. Hello, Amarjotji, how are you?
Good morning, Vipulji. I'm good. How are you?
Good, good, good. So I believe you are not driving. So we have
no, I'm not. I'm not.
Okay.
Vipulji, can you take a quick screenshot of everyone? If everyone can turn on their cameras and look at the cameras. So just to put on our social media.
Sure. Time for a quick group photo, everyone.
Mr. Yadav, are you able to turn on your camera?
Rajatji.
Okay, that's fine. I'll do it at the count of 3. Okay, everyone look, smile. 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay, we'll do it again. Mr. Yadav, okay. Join in at the count of 3 again. 1, 2, 3. Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Tejas. All right, so let us go right next to our next speaker, Sir Glenn Campbell. Nagasrat, if you can bring up the introduction slide, please. So, Mr. Glenn Campbell, Nagasrat.
Just a second, Vipul.
Yeah, sure. We are just running about 10 minutes over, so somewhere along the way, we'll have to catch up.
Hope, is it visible?
Yeah, for some reason, the last line always cuts off. But anyway, Glenn Campbell, our next speaker, he is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Investment, Partnerships and Innovation at Infrastructure Canada, which involves major project development and fostering partnerships with the private sector using alternative finance and delivery models. His responsibilities include support for the Canada Infrastructure Bank, as well as promoting public-private partnerships and use of innovative finance in the public infrastructure space. He is also responsible for federal major bridge construction projects and oversees portfolio coordination of Crown corporations such as Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority and Jacques Cartier Champlain Bridges Incorporated in Montreal, as well as federal interests in Waterfront Toronto Revitalization Corporation. Previously, he was ADM of the Canada Infrastructure Bank Transition Office, Director General Financial Institutions at Finance Canada, responsible for domestic financial sector policy covering banking and insurance. His prior role at Finance Canada was as the Director General, International Policy and Analysis, covering international financial institutions as well as global economic policy coordination under G20, G7, and IMEC, and served as Senior Finance Official for IPEC. Earlier in his career, Glenn was posted as finance counselor in New York during the global financial crisis. While most of his career was at Finance Canada, he has varied experience across federal departments, including Global Affairs Canada, Industry Canada, and the Treasury Board Secretariat. So over to you, Mr. Campbell.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'll try to abbreviate my remarks in the interest of time. Thank you, Mr. Jani, and also good day to the High Commissioner and Mr. Minister Prada. I'm very pleased to join you today to foster collaboration and a shared experience and infrastructure between our two countries. As pointed out, my role focuses on alternative finance and how to adopt and learn from others on leveraging private investment through partnerships to foster innovation and solve public policy challenges and infrastructure. Before getting into specifics, let me share a few points to underscore my keenness to speak to you today. On the personal front, I'm married to Indo-Canadian diaspora, my wife, and her father-in-law who grew up in Mumbai. And I've had the pleasure to visit and travel across India many times. And over the past 20 years, I've seen a lot of the progress and opportunities firsthand. On the professional front, in my past roles at the Finance Ministry, I was also the lead on the Canada-India Financial Sector Dialogue, and where we talked about collaboration between Canada, India, and banking and insurance. And prior to that, collaborated with India in major G20 activities, including co-chairing of the key macroeconomic framework committee for several years, in really good collaboration between Canada and India on the global stage. For the past 5 years, I've led Canada's efforts at the national level in promoting P3, PPP infrastructure opportunities, and as you know, led the transition office to create the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Similar to India, the path to closing our infrastructure gaps must include leveraging the private sector investment and expertise, and governments as well as the private sector need to be informed investors. In Canada, the majority of public infrastructure is owned and managed by our provinces and territories and the municipal level, as pointed out by Minister Panda. And of course, they have a lot more experience in direct planning, building, and delivering on a day-to-day basis and face many of the infrastructure challenges really at the local level. Federally and at the national level, we have our own assets and challenges, but largely focused on how we use national funding to determine and shape shared priorities and appropriate burden sharing over projects and infrastructure. Part of this is determining what are national priorities, which is why we are launching a new national infrastructure assessment and seeking to determine which challenges are better suited to government funding or where alternative and innovative approaches can be used to relieve the burden on the taxpayer. Canada as a whole has been contributing its expertise, cooperating and learning from others' experience through the OECD as well as G20's Global Infrastructure Hub. Both international organizations doing an excellent job of collecting and disseminating knowledge and expertise in infrastructure, P3 and project finance, including from both Canada and India, I might add. I was pleased to see recently India present its approach and new initiatives in public-private partnerships to the Canada Council for Public-Private Partnerships, a major global conference held here in Canada last month, and it echoes some of the comments mentioned today about how advanced India is becoming in the P3 market. Very, very formidable. India has some exciting opportunities around monetizing assets and asset recycling, and looking at ways to crowd in private finance to help solve public policy challenges, whether roads, water, wastewater, electricity, and broadband, and then other sectors. We've really taken note. Of high note is our two largest pension funds, Canada Pension Plan and Investment Board, and Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, have recently invested considerably for a 50% share in India's National Infrastructure Trust. This will be an extension of investments in Indian toll highways and other assets. These Canadian funds, including AIMCO, that I know is speaking a little bit later, and pension funds like them as part of the Maple 8, or private funds like Brookfield, which I heard earlier, represented by others on today's panels, are really keenly interested in investing in India. And I would hope Indian investors are keenly interested in reciprocating the opportunities in Canada, include those that Minister Panda had set out, particularly in Alberta, but also elsewhere. In Canada, we are still in early stages of adopting more revenue models where infra is priced to create revenue streams to attract private investment. We're perhaps a bit more focused on greenfield investment and where risk can be transferred in new builds, a little bit more sensitive on the brownfield, but we're both learning from what India is doing and other countries. So we're watching very closely what our peer countries are doing to deploy these new models, and also looking keenly at the public reaction. We have revenue models in electricity and transit, but we remain behind on roads, bridges, water, and wastewater, and we look forward to learning from India's progress in the future. In terms of new priorities, Infrastructure Canada and the Government of Canada have engaged on a national infrastructure assessment initiative, as I mentioned, to help guide future needs and priority setting. That will really help guide at the national government and hopefully coordinate provincially as well, developing a pipeline of projects, both publicly and privately, that will help draw attention to where investment is best placed, both government and private sector. Let me conclude by talking about some clear priorities going forward. We center around two themes, and we think they'd be the same in Canada as in India. One is reducing GHG emissions and our carbon footprint in building and operating infrastructure, whether public or private. And two, building more resilient infrastructure that mitigates the severe impact of climate change. Both of our countries have been inflicted with severe weather and events, with Canada dealing with severe flooding in BC and Atlantic Canada, and high fire incidents and threats across Canada, particularly in the west, and melting permafrost in northern Canada. We need to encourage our supply chains and infrastructure ecosystem to continue to innovate and build more carbon-sensitive infrastructure, and to develop new means and methods to build cleaner and more resilient infrastructure. This is an area of global importance, and I trust our cooperation can continue in mutual investing in our economies, sharing best practices on models and approaches to funding and financing, but also sharing technological solutions through business-to-business relationship. In closing, also note Invest in Canada and the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service and Export Development Canada being available in the ecosystem to help facilitate further trade. Thank you very much. Look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for the precise and brief to the point remarks. Really appreciate that. And so also good to know that you have a very strong connection to India. So, waiting for your next trip to India, maybe we can share some experiences. All right, so before we go to our next speaker, Terry Wallace, I think it is best now to break up the sessions and take up our first Q&A session for the first four speakers. So I have two questions for each of the first four speakers, and in the interest of time, if you can keep your answers a bit brief so that we can then go back to the session two. So I will start with the High Commissioner Anshumanji. My first question for you, sir, is that infrastructure projects often run into litigations, environmental clearances, land acquisition issues, face center-state coordination issues with different party-led governments having different priorities sometimes, as Mr. Panda just mentioned. So how are these challenges being mitigated?
Thank you, Vipulji. And just quickly, the new infrastructure project from very conceptual stage in India are being de-risked in several measures being built into it. One is the importance that has been accorded to the participation of state governments, because they are in India, like in Canada, being a federal government, a federal structure. The state governments are largely responsible for several of the aspects that you have mentioned, including land acquisition. So these aspects are now being handled much more carefully, much more closely monitored under a large de-risking program that is making the projects inherently less litigious, I should say, in terms of risks as we go ahead. The second, which I touched upon briefly, is the integration of all the project monitoring and management under various umbrella schemes. Like the Gati Shakti allows us to have a geospatial framework under which all the projects of infrastructure in India are being mapped using precise mapping from ISRO. This allows, reduces the friction space, which often involves in terms of property rights and lack of records, which prompt the litigation in first place. So these are some of the de-risking strategies which India is using for some of the major projects as we move ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, sir. My second question for you is, you work with Canadian companies, pension funds, and business leaders on a daily basis. While the official government-to-government ties may be performing a little bit under potential for a while, it is the private sector that is largely driving the bus these days, or at least that's the impression. What do you hear from the Canadian C-suite executives about what are they most optimistic about and what concerns do they want addressed so that they can participate more enthusiastically in the growing India story?
Absolutely, Vipulji. I'm so glad that you asked us that. I think the growth trajectory of India-Canada relationship is a testimony itself to the kind of strong complementarities which exist between the two economies and the confidence which Canadian CEOs have, especially the heads of the various investment organizations in Canada, on the strength of Indian economy. See, there is an asymmetry. Canada has a population of 38, 39 million. This is a G7 country, but the overall market size of Canada is quite limited. And Canada is still essentially a primary product exporting nation. My biggest portfolio from Canada is of primary products. So that's why, places like Saskatchewan figure very highly in our bilateral trade. So the trade has grown over the last 5 years, as have investments. Most of the investment has come in terms of private equity and portfolio investment from Canada. And that itself, the Canadian investors have put their money where their mouth is. The investment have risen from 5 billion 2015 to over 55 billion today. And that itself is an indicator of the confidence which the Canadian CEOs have. Over 1,000 companies are now located and doing business. Canadian companies are located and doing business in India. We see increase in number of business visas, for example, as COVID winds down. That shows that there is a desire for people to go and engage India. We have seen an increased number of business queries, both from India and from Canada, in terms of engaging on a commercial basis. So moving forward, we see commerce and investment and trade as being the driver of our bilateral relationship. I mean, the political noise is there, and like India, Canada is a multifaceted, noisy, thriving democracy. It's only natural that those noises will be there. But the core of our relationship, I think, is gradually moving towards a more commercial, more business-oriented, more business-led relationship, which I think is how it should be.
Thank you, sir. 55 billion, 1,000 companies, that's fantastic to hear. And we hope to see that number double over the next few years, hopefully. So my next question is for Rahul Agarwal for Invest India. Again, two questions for you, Rahul, as well. My first question for you is private sector investment in roads and highways through the PPP route was 25,999 crore rupees around 2015, or 42%. which came down to 25,000 crore rupees or 16% around 2019. While the bank loans for this sector also came down from 15.2% in fiscal year 2015 to 11.5% in 2018. So what efforts are being made to reverse the tide in both the private sector investments and bank loans for this critical sector?
Thank you. I think that's a very well-researched question. So I think there was a change in strategy in how we were building our roads. So till 2014, 2015, we were doing a lot of PPPs, right? The BOT style PPPs in roads. There were issues there. I think, I think the primary issue was that, the same developer had to take the construction risk as well as the traffic risk. And I think you've seen, that's, generally not the easiest, and taking both these risks make the capital very, very expensive. So from 2015 onwards, actually, we changed our strategy a bit. We divided the traffic risk and the construction risk separately. So what we started doing is that most of our construction today is happening either in EPC or a hybrid annuity model, as we call it, which means that the capital required from the private sector for constructing roads, that requirement went down substantially, making it cheaper to construct roads in India. So that's why you see those numbers, right? So the private sector was not taking loans from the banks. Neither they were investing their own capital. They were actually focusing on constructing best quality roads at the best possible price. Once these roads were constructed, that was the time when we started, inviting global pension funds and private equity investors to come and acquire those roads and use that capital, from that acquisition process to again construct the road, which is that our asset recycling model. So that was there. We again want to go back to the standard BOT model, but on limited number of roads where risks are minimized. As I think the High Commissioner talked about the land acquisition environmental concerns, the way we've handled that. So only on certain projects where we have taken, we have made sure that those risks do not exist for private sector, as well as we see high feasibility for those projects. Only there we want to invite BOT projects. Otherwise, we want to reduce the cost and go on with what we are doing right
now. Fair enough. So the second question for you is, while the large pension funds and big Canadian companies are already investing in India, what efforts are being made to reach out to smaller funds and companies in Canada and in the overall global investment in India's infrastructure sector? Where does Canada stand as of today?
I think for institutional investments, specifically in infrastructure and real estate, I think Canada is, I think I've not done numbers, but I think most likely you are at 1, maybe 2. I've not really done numbers at that level. But, I think on the first part of the question, for reaching out to smaller funds, I think this team, which I represent, the Financial Investors Initiative team, we reach out, we reach out to every investor in the country, in Canada or elsewhere as well, to tell them the opportunities, and I can confidently tell you that we are in touch with a lot of pension funds, much smaller in size, for investing in India. Invest India per se, we work with all size of companies, whether it's a startup or a large scale corporation, and we are very happy to facilitate on investors at that level. So that's the one part of it. The second part is that, I think we have created opportunities in India where smaller investors can also participate. So the likes of InvITs, I think we recently had a InvIT for transmission. So one of our public sector undertakings for transmission, which we call Power Grid, where any investor, as in any institutional investor of any size, can actually come and invest in India. We have the NIIF, which invites institutional investors to participate and invest with them who do not have large capacities on the ground to invest as well. So we are open to all sizes and happy to handhold and facilitate them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahulji. So, Mr. Panda, I'm coming next to you. My first question for Minister Prasad Panda. You have worked on massive infrastructure projects in India and now oversee the infrastructure ministry for Alberta, making you the ideal candidate to bring Canada and India closer on this particular file. So where do you see the possibilities and potential, especially between Alberta and India? And if the potential is not being fully met right now, why do you think that is the case? Mr. Panda?
Sorry, I was muted. That's a very good question, Vipulji. The potential has not met because we heard from Anshuman that they want their infrastructure investments to be tripled in a few years, which is a very ambitious goal, $4.5 trillion. Canadian companies, although as Rahul said right now, they have a presence there. They may be high in numbers right now, but that's nowhere near the potential because Canadian companies have capacity and they have the expertise because Canada is a large country. So as I said, we are sparsely populated and unlike India, which is densely populated. So we need to create infrastructure and maintain it. So our companies have expertise, our governments, provincial governments, each government has expertise. So there is a lot of opportunity out of that $4.5 trillion. That's a big cake. And Canadian, I know I'm competing here with my good friend. I saw Amarjot there. And I know Anshuman is trying to create a tension there between Saskatchewan and Alberta to compete. And Alberta is ready to, with the help from people like Glenn, I'm glad to hear he's son-in-law of India. Me being Amchi Mumbaikar, it's more important that your in-laws are from Maharashtra. So with good ambassadors like that, when they collaborate with our Indian bureaucrats, like the consular generals in Toronto and Vancouver, our companies can step up and help India. What India needs to do is to cut the red tape and facilitate that. I have seen that from private sector, from my past life, having worked on mega projects in Gujarat. It's a possibility. Canadian companies can contribute, but we have to cut that red tape, and there is a lot of potential. And India is also fastest growing economy, and Canadian companies, particularly Alberta, can feed with our agricultural products. We can beat Saskatchewan for sure. Scott Moe, I spoke to him. He is very, he's very eager to even increase that business between Saskatchewan and India. Same thing with Doug Ford, and I'm sure Amarjot will talk about that. He'll do his sales speech, but we are all eager to come and have a reasonable share of that and be part of that growth story of India.
Sure. So the second question is, Alberta is facing multiple challenges, both within the Canadian policy perspectives and from the once reliable partner in the United States. Whether it is Keystone or Enbridge Line 5, or we don't know what might come up next year. Alberta is also prepared a 20-year strategic capital plan, as far as I understand.
Yep.
Where do you see your province 5 to 10 years from now emerging from today's challenges? Because a healthy and prosperous Alberta is vital for a healthy and prosperous Canada as well.
Absolutely. That's actually, I forgot to mention yesterday, we released that 20-year strategic capital plan. That was part of the Infrastructure Accountability Act I introduced and passed in Alberta legislature 10 days ago. With that came this 20-year strategic capital plan, which is a long-term. It's not just, so each budget year, we bring in capital plan, which gives the forecast for the next 4 years or 3 years. Whereas this 20-year strategic capital plan looks at the long-term emerging trends, not only the current trends, but the emerging trends with the improvement in technologies and modern infrastructure needs. That's why we introduced that. I hope that will provide the opportunity for future governments to plan infrastructure ahead. But you mentioned most of Alberta's exports are all going to one country. So we are dependent on one customer because all our pipelines are going only in one direction, which is south to United States. So we are selling. It's not just Alberta, it's the Canadian product, which is sold at a discount to US because we are struck with only one customer. Whereas on the other hand, India, with, they need 1,000 gigawatts of energy. It takes time to get there. In the meantime, Alberta and Canada has a potential to provide that energy security for India. So we need to look at that, and I'm counting on all 1.8 million Indo-Canadians to speak up and represent to the government of Canada because they have the lead. I can talk endlessly on the bilateral relationships, but Alberta don't have the jurisdiction. Government of Canada has the jurisdiction, and we need government of Canada to take the lead in diversifying not only the products, but also diversifying the markets. Countries like India, the fastest growing countries with 800 million young population, middle-class population with growing aspirations. So Canada can feed and fuel, as I said before, but we need government of Canada's help. And all of you, I encourage you to represent to the federal government as well, and Alberta will play our part. And provincial governments are very eager to work with India. As I said, government of Ontario, government of Saskatchewan, those two premiers I spoke a few times, and our premier is very, very, very keen in advancing those relations, so both trade relations and also cultural relations.
Thank you, Mr. Panda, for that. So now this is the next set of questions are for Glenn, and then we'll go to our second session with Terry Wallace, Deepak Darda, and Ahmed Mubashir. So my first question to you, Mr. Campbell, is Canadian technology and Canadian investment in India's infrastructure sector is growing, mainly through private efforts as of now. Now that Canada is facing challenges with China and also with the US on several key infrastructure projects, how keen is Canada today and in the days to come to reach out to and work more closely with India in this sector and beyond?
Thank you for the question. And let me just support what Minister Panda had said, and in full agreement that Canada has always needed to diversify its markets, and particularly those growing markets, India included. And it's very important we set up really the policy frameworks and the trade-related frameworks, and then encourage our mutual private sectors to really do that country-to-country, business-to-business connection where capital flows and technology go hand in hand. And I think India does present, continues to present a real opportunity, and followed by our pension funds, which I hope, and other infrastructure funds, that they also encourage deeper supply chain considerations along the lines that Minister Panda had mentioned, is making sure that we're not just managing capital flows in particular projects, but as they're being procured, are we really thinking about the wider net that benefits both countries? And let me end by saying Canada and India continue to collaborate through the G20 and OECD, which is the best for developing mutual transfer of technology and policies like around procurement.
Okay. As they say, adversity also brings with it new opportunities. What are the priority or focus areas for Infrastructure Canada moving forward both within Canada and in terms of overseas collaborations?
So in terms of within Canada, to mention, the government of Canada is really an informed investor of using our spending power in helping provinces like Alberta and Ontario who are here to achieve our shared objectives. And let me just echo, there's a lot of alignment between the federal government and the provincial governments in meeting our infrastructure deficit. And I think the government of Canada is shifting more towards what are the key needs of communities, and there's been a big focus on transit, also now more so on the generation and distribution transmission of clean power, moving towards a cleaner net zero economy. Those are two really big priorities. But we also think about not just big projects, but small community projects and the inclusiveness of the infrastructure agenda so everyone can participate. And then internationally, we're going to continue to encourage other countries like India to develop those stable long-term policy frameworks to really attract and retain that kind of investment. And I think even beyond the programs India's put in place as of late, providing that longer-term stable framework is what really is going to attract more private investment from Canada. And in Canada, we should do the same to attract Indian investment in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. So that concludes our first session. I would request all the speakers for the first session to stay back with us if they can, while we now move to the second session.